about 2 days ago. They didn't plan it, they just accidentally, that's when they turned up. And they had the best time.
Like internal infrastructure.
Well, I heard
is
Bohemian Rhapsody
Should we
done
start?
with the
stuff is all built on their
Okay,
stuff.
cool.
You know, that's
So,
that Queen song.
Sounds good.
Oh, yeah.
With the two
I know somebody that was
tubas
on
and
the
two
secret
euphonia,
manager,
and it was amazing.
Project team, and they're like, yeah, it's all built on Untitled. And like, if you have some sort of like managed service, like they're managed, like Elasticsearch, it's all based on EC2 in the background. Well, it's not Elasticsearch.
Cool.
Hopefully they get a price break.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Okay.
Okay, hi guys. Want to welcome all of you for coming into the AWS Michigan Meetup today. I am Amy, if you don't know me already. I'm the social media coordinator and event coordinator for Right Brain. I run the AWS Michigan Meetups, so I book speakers. Here's a shameless plug. If you're looking to speak or want to speak on a topic, feel free to solicit me either through the Meetup page, or I can give you my email after the Meetup. And we have these here every month, usually on the third Thursday. Next month's going to be pretty exciting. We have a AWS mini security jam. It's basically a capture the flag event. It's going to be a different format than what we normally do. It'll be running from 5:30 p.m. till about 8:30. So there's more details on the Meetup page if you're interested. And we'll be emailing out things too as they come available. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sterling Windmill. He's a production engineer at Duo.
Hello, everyone. Awesome. So, yeah, my name is Sterling Windmill. That is a real name. I didn't make it up for today or for this event. You can sort of consider it to be the combination of my hippie grandmother who gave me the first name and my English stepfather who gave me the last name. And I work at Duo Security. I lead the production engineering team. Is anybody here familiar with Duo? Have you heard of the company? Okay. Have you used Duo or familiar? Used Duo? Okay, cool. That's good. Awesome. Excited about that. I'll throw my agenda out here quickly. I'm going to talk a little bit about Duo. It sounds like many of you are already familiar. One particular individual I know is very familiar with Duo. We have a fellow Duo colleague in the audience. Thanks for coming. I'll talk about production engineering, the team that I lead at Duo, what FedRAMP is, why we have chosen to involve ourselves in that compliance program, why other organizations have done so, talk about kind of the intersection between Amazon and FedRAMP, and then end with an opportunity for you to ask questions. But also expectation setting wise, if you have a question or want me to slow down and try to explain something, raise your hand, interrupt me, flag me down, let me know. I'm happy to stop and help out in any way I can. I want this to be interactive. Who knows what FedRAMP is? No one. Have you heard of FedRAMP? Okay. Oh, you have. Okay. We have one member. Who is involved or has been involved in sort of compliance-related activities as part of current or past jobs? Okay. Who loves that aspect of their work? No hands. Okay. Not surprising. I'm not going to change that for you today. But I can talk a little bit about our journey and some what I think are interesting aspects about FedRAMP. So we'll get to that point. A lot of this might be repeat because it sounds like almost everybody here knows of Duo. Duo is a cloud-hosted security service that got its start in the 2010 timeframe. Founded by a few Michigan alumni, Doug Song and John Oberheide. When I joined, this was now about 3.5 years ago, late 2014, we had about 80 employees. We're now at more than 600. I stopped counting exact figures because as soon as I say a number, it's out of date, which is crazy growth in a really positive way. So I'm super happy to have been part of that leg of the company's journey. We protect organizations by offering security services and ones that are easy to use. We think a lot about people in the way we treat security and treat our end user community. From a high level perspective, we verify the trust of users, their endpoints, and we make sure that access to any applications or business solutions that the companies that use our services have for access or offer access to their end user communities are secured in positive fashions. I'll give you a little demo here. Has anyone seen some of these things? Are you actively using this in your day-to-day at this point? I see a thumbs up. So maybe if I will succeed in showing something here. And I didn't log out, let me do that. So I have my phone, I have my laptop. I'm going to be accessing some internal to Duo, but could be internal to another customer of ours infrastructure. You can see this says I can use my U2F token to log in. That's a piece of hardware I have plugged into my laptop. This is a type of hardware key that we support. I can also push this button and send myself a push notification that I can receive on my phone. I can approve that, and I'm in. So we try to make accessing even complex IT systems and environments as easy as what you just saw. A lot of things happen as part of that transaction. A lot of that's tucked away and hidden from you. But this is an example of kind of that focus on user experience that we have in how we operate, how we produce a product and a service. You might ask or be curious about what production engineering is. I'll talk about a few different aspects of our organization. We have product design, so this is the area within engineering that's embedded and thinks and focuses most on that end user experience. A big part of what makes us successful and where we want to spend time. We have a security organization, a labs aspect of that focuses on R&D and sort of skunkworks projects that end up making their way into our product in many cases. A large engineering team with diverse talents and skill sets, a really strong team from my perspective, folks I love to come in to work with and alongside of. And then production engineering, which is my part of this crazy organization, crazy in a good way. We are the team that is closest to Duo's infrastructure and is most closely aligned with making sure that our customers have a great experience from a production service perspective. If you want to look at some numbers that sort of outline Duo today or help you understand the impact we have more than 10,000 customers. 98% of those customers, at least the ones who've responded to this kind of request for information, recommend our services. These NPS or Net Promoter Scores are really, really high if you compare them to competitors, definitely any player in the security space. Individuals tend to not love security solutions or anything that sort of gets in their way. So this is a big part of how we know we're doing well in making services that provide real value and are easy to use. We're over 600 folks. I think we're over that by probably more than 100 people today. But again, that growth over the number of years I've been there has been astounding. Also, we are loved by our employees, and we have a really great Glassdoor rating, which I, again, feel really proud about. We have a few sites where development occurs, primarily Ann Arbor, Michigan here, and then Austin, Texas. With some exceptions for folks that work remotely, we have what I think is a really great experience, and we work really hard to make sure that's a positive one for those remote employees. And I'll get a little bit into infrastructure here. Before I do, any questions, anything I can help with in terms of content I've already talked through?
A quick question. I saw that you had something that said you're monitoring your device ongoingly, and so that's, how often does somebody get reminded that their devices, do you see that, like do you monitor that and in people's insecure devices or help them?
This sort of like out-of-datedness?
Yeah, because that's an issue a lot of times.
Yeah, it's a good question. So the way this works today is when a user is interacting with what we call the frame, that's this display on the left, and they're trying to authenticate against something internal to their organization generally. We do certain checks, and then we compare what we see to the company's policy that's in place. So a company could have in place a policy that says if certain software is this many days or this many versions out of date, don't allow access. In this case, it looks like this policy is configured to prompt the user, this is an acceptable out-of-datedness, but if you were to click this button, if it were live, it would bring you to some instructions that would help you understand what is necessary in order to meet the company's requirements. As far as frequency of that check, today it's primarily when these interactions occur. There's some work underway to allow for that to be more of a persistent data feed, but that's not how it operates today.
And then you also check on the other, for your phone, it looks like.
Yep, correct. So customers can also put policy in place that governs what iOS or Android versions are allowed and some other properties of the phone that we look for in terms of giving them those controls.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. Infrastructure. So I'm assuming a lot of you have experience with Amazon or managing infrastructure, whether that's in Amazon or outside of Amazon. You can't read this, but it's sort of a high-level illustration of part of our infrastructure footprint. I mostly wanted to focus on the fact that we today have 57 what we call deployments of our service. So these are sort of independent sets of infrastructure set up such that we get some scalability properties out of them, and there's some risk containment properties as well. So if one deployment is in a bad state, it doesn't affect customers elsewhere. And then in each deployment, we have enough to run our service in a high availability fashion, so we're not susceptible to single instance failures or those sort of pitfalls. We use a lot of the standard Amazon techniques and sort of best practices in order to keep service availability high for customers. We're in 8 Amazon regions, and if you use Amazon in production, we use a lot of the same stuff you probably do. So EC2, EBS, Route 53, ELB, SES. There's a ton of these services I could name. If you're curious about any specifics there, I can definitely dig in further. Otherwise, I'll move on. Yeah?
Did Duo start on AWS?
Yeah, so with maybe a tiny distinction that someone who was there early enough could make, in that I think the first version was probably running on a computer underneath some stairs in a basement. But for the first time it became something real, I think it was Amazon only and Amazon first. Some metrics that I think are pretty cool. We get more than 1 billion requests during any given month at the steady state at this moment. Less than 100 milliseconds to process those on average. And then since we have been tracking this data over a long period of time, 2017 through today in aggregate, we see greater than 4 nines in terms of the number of requests we get that are successful or successfully processed by our systems. We have a public SLA of 3 nines, but we have an internal target that's much more aggressive than that, and we generally meet and exceed that, which is pretty fantastic. So it speaks both to Amazon as an infrastructure provider and also to our abilities to sit on top of that platform.
How quickly is that 1 billion going up? Is it like exponential? Because that seems small to me. Like.
Yeah. So I don't know the exact rate at which it increases, but I know every graph I've looked at where this is charted over any amount of time is definitely hockey stick in nature. I could definitely dig in and get more specifics, but I just don't know them offhand.
It just seems with it's not just being mobile, being just your cell phones now, that you have mobile devices and more people are just widely adapting it across the board. It just seems like you'd hit 2 billion before the end of the year, probably.
Very possible, yeah, for sure. I already asked a question about who knows what FedRAMP is. I didn't get any takers except for maybe this fine individual.
I said I heard of it.
You heard of it. What have you heard? Anything good?
So I work at the university.
Ah, okay.
And so
okay.
there's a lot of things that have to do with compliance. I work at the College of Engineering, so there's a lot of research we have that has certain requirements, but most people are doing those in our on-campus cluster and things like that because but FedRAMP is something that I haven't come across as a compliance target that we had to hit.
Okay.
It's mostly things like ITAR or,
Okay. I know this much about ITAR, but I can hopefully tell you a little bit more about FedRAMP. So FedRAMP, if anyone here is familiar with PCI or SOC 2 or maybe even HIPAA, you can kind of think about FedRAMP as almost a combination of different aspects of those programs, but on steroids, and specifically catering towards cloud service providers, not anyone who's providing software or on-prem solutions for the federal marketplace. So if you operate a cloud service provider and you want to do business with federal agencies, this is the set of requirements that the federal government has put in place to sort of govern the ability to sell into that market. It comes out of the GSA, which if you're familiar, might make sense. If you're not, it's sort of the organization that provides a lot of infrastructure across the board. And when I say infrastructure, I don't mean necessarily just technical or computing infrastructure. It's office space, telecommunications, a lot of very core sort of requirements for these other agencies that do business. So the FedRAMP program comes out of that GSA. Why do it? I'll get a little bit more into sort of what constitutes the lift, but it is not an easy or unburdensome road to traverse in order to go from interested party to someone who's gone all the way through to getting authorized status, which is sort of the end state, but not really. We'll talk about why. So why do this? Why spend the time? Why spend the money? It's primarily because the federal sort of ecosystem is increasingly comfortable with and adopting cloud-based technologies. That's not always been true. And this is the really only option for doing business in that space. trying to get a federal agency to do business with you without this kind of compliance requirement underneath you is difficult, if not impossible. And it can have big benefits to organizations outside of the federal space as well. Generally speaking, if a company is mature enough to get through this gate, even companies in the private sector are going to look at that as a positive and treat that as an attestation that the company's doing things that are correct and are trustworthy. There's also more than 2 million full-time employees here and all the organizations they work with that need these kinds of security properties in moving away from more traditional solutions. So there's a big untapped marketplace. As you might expect, there's a lot of jargon. Anytime you sort of cross paths with security and the government, this is going to be the result. I am still acclimating to a lot of these terms. I live and breathe this on a daily, if not weekly basis at this moment, and it still doesn't always sit with me such that I can just rattle these off the top of my head. And this is not a comprehensive list. There's more than what's here. If you spend time with security practitioners, you're probably used to this sort of alphabet salad being thrown around. I'll touch on the sort of key ones here that I'll also use later on, just to sort of help that settle in. If we start from near the top, an ATO is authorization to operate, so that's sort of what you're seeking as you go through this process. You want authorization to operate in this space and to provide your services to these federal agencies. The JAB, or Joint Authorization Board, is a body of agencies, typically some of the more the more serious, I should say, agencies, so things like the DoD would be in that group, as opposed to maybe the post office. And a group of these agencies get together and work to authorize or otherwise govern the ability for CSPs to get through this process. PMO is effectively the owner of the FedRAMP program in terms of the people who make decisions and otherwise produce documentation and make sure that they're setting expectations, and they're working with the JAB to sort of tee up CSPs for success, with the JAB being the one who finally sort of makes a decision on a go, no-go basis. Does anyone remember what FedRAMP actually stands for besides the person who'd be cheating?
Federal Risk Assessment Management Program.
You are
Authorization.
close,
Yeah.
so close. 3PAO is a company you bring in generally to help. They can't advise you. You're paying them money to effectively ensure that you're doing the right things prior to you submitting your package, and we'll get into that in a little bit, to these other parties to get authorized. That's generally like a multi-week or multi-month engagement. The company comes in, they can help set expectations with you, they can collect information. They're basically auditing you and then generating a report and passing it along to these agency partners that run the program. Authorization boundary is everything that's inside of what you are asking to be authorized. We can talk a little bit more about that later. There's multiple sort of FedRAMP stages, or the status of a CSP that's going through this process. You can be ready, you can be in process, you can be authorized. I'll touch on that a little bit more. NIST, if you look at this pyramid, sits sort of right beneath FedRAMP. So all the NIST requirements are part of FedRAMP. FedRAMP is effectively a superset of those. And there's a lot of those. I'll talk more about that as well. RAR is a report that your third-party assessment organization helps you generate. POAMs are effectively you saying you can't quite meet the control today, and you're going to document what you're going to do to satisfy it after something like a readiness report gets established and completed. And then the SSP is effectively a giant document that includes everything that is being assessed to determine if your organization is authorized. This is multiple hundreds of pages and a huge lift in terms of any organization creating this thing. Any questions about any of this? I know I'm throwing a lot of terms at you.
They have external auditors that come in to do the assessment and then write up the POAM.
Yeah, so that's effectively the 3PAO. So these are organizations
I
that
see.
we as a CSP would pay, but they've been trained and they've been given guidance by the PMO in terms of how they should conduct these audits, these assessments. From a high-level perspective, it's sort of a four-step process. You start at the top, the section that says SSP, and this is that, again, going back to the prior slide, the system security plan. You are creating gigantic amounts of documentation, artifacts that go very deep into how you operate. Data flow diagrams that show every port and protocol that's open, every type of data that might traverse your system, anytime you process it, store it, anytime it leaves your infrastructure. Think, again, about a really, really intense version of anything you've ever been asked to produce in the past, unless you've been through a FedRAMP exercise. And this is the starting point for FedRAMP, but it generally takes most organizations at least a year to get to the point where they can even produce this thing. Then getting through the rest of this to the point of being authorized, which is that bottom slice, generally takes at least another 1 to 2 years. It's not uncommon for it to be 2 years. That's not all because it takes that much time. It's in some cases because there's a structured there are structured time windows wherein some of these activities can occur, and that's mandated by the federal government. They only allow a certain number of CSPs in on a regular basis or over the course of a year. You sort of have to get your ducks in a row and submit your paperwork at the right moment and hope that it gets moved on to the next step and then proceed from there. But you create this giant SSP, and I'll touch on that a little bit more later. You are now ready to become ready. You're not ready yet. You can find this 3PAO, pay them to come in, look at your SSP, assess you, and then you are FedRAMP ready if you've passed that gate. You are now worth some of these agencies giving you a sniff test and allowing you to consider, or considering you allowable to move past. You can then be looked at as in process and eventually move all the way through to authorized once either an agency that you are working with and they are sponsoring you, or that JAB that I talked about, which is a group of those agencies, is willing to say that what they see looks good. Any questions about this?
So do they look and say, this they meet all the requirements, they look good, or is you look good, they've actually ran business through you, and that's how you become authorized?
So it's sort of a combination of both. In order to get all the way to authorized, depending upon the track you take, there could be a requirement that you already have a customer and they're actively using your services. It's almost always the case that they want you to have already been providing your services in a commercial capacity, and they use that fact as, if less about controls, it's more about the sort of viability of your business. But there are some options that would exist that don't require you to have an active customer. Some of the authorization processes and that RAR definitely aren't just tell us what you do, it's show us how it works. And so a lot of that comes through those processes.
Okay.
I talked about the authorization boundary, so this is everything that you're asking these federal agencies to assess. They've produced some guidance very recently, so I stole this image from that. They change their mind relatively frequently, given that they're a federal organization here. And so this guidance was a lot more stringent than what has existed in the past. And this is very much so because at the end of the day, these are people. They're groups of people. They're trying to see success with the balancing act between the security properties they want and actually seeing CSPs succeed, because they, at the end of the day, want cloud service providers to be able to do business in this federal market. And so what they saw happening was they saw CSPs getting really far into the process, and then information coming out of the CSP that should have come earlier that invalidated their ability to move forward. So this was things like, it ends up that you're using these external services and pumping data into them, but you didn't call it out in any of your documentation. So you can't move forward. There's a reset button, and this is inefficient for everybody. So they released new guidance that says it's not just your own offering that needs to be in boundary. You don't just have to document what you do. You have to document anytime you send federal data outside of your own infrastructure to these external services that you might leverage. And I'll give you some examples of those later. The boundary is primarily concerned with things like confidentiality, integrity, and availability of federal data. So this is data that comes from federal organizations. Think combinations of things like usernames, email addresses, IP addresses, any other metadata that would identify a federal end user or a corporation, I shouldn't say corporation, agency. Anytime that you're processing, transmitting, storing that kind of information, they're generally going to want to see that system be in the boundary. So you can imagine that's pretty holistic for a lot of cloud service providers. And it gets really tangled in terms of, I didn't even consider that that was a thing, but now I need to pull it into my boundary and document it and really think about the security properties of the whole system end to end. There are some things that they're okay with being out of scope that don't need the same rigor. These are things like corporate services, think maybe a help desk system. You can put the responsibility on a customer to say, don't give us certain information here, and if you do, we have to identify how we're going to scrub that. Or internal sort of development or operational operations, things like build systems, CI processes, maybe tester development instances of applications that don't actually contain real customer data. You don't have to sort of attest to those or treat them in the same manner. And there's a shared responsibility model, very much like what Amazon and customers have. In this case, Amazon is our infrastructure as a service or platform as a service provider. We're providing a SaaS or software as a service solution to our customers. That's where the boundary is for us. And then customers of ours or customers of that SaaS service would be bound by FISMA, which is a separate set of requirements placed upon federal agencies. It is more about what's on-prem or on their own internal networks. Then there's this whole big can of worms around FIPS. Has anybody done anything with FIPS? No. Is anybody familiar with it? Okay. So FIPS is a bigger program that has more governance. FIPS 140-2 is specifically about cryptography. So this is a means by which cryptographic methods, algorithms, and even specific implementations can be validated. And FedRAMP requires that any crypto you're doing is FIPS validated. And it's not just saying, use these algorithms, but not these ones. It's not as easy as if you're familiar with TLS, saying, use TLS version this or higher. It is literally, use this particular implementation of a means by which to generate SHA-512 checksums, or use this particular build of OpenSSL compiled in this very specific way, or only use Red Hat's version of OpenSSL, this version or greater, running on this operating system with this patch level. In some cases, it's even on this kind of hardware from Dell, or this model with this BIOS version. So it can get really crazy. For us, we had to spend a lot of time here both understanding how the requirements influenced us and what we needed to do as a result, and then actually making the changes. And so this touched a lot of our application code, our processes of building it, our infrastructure, and it was a fairly large lift for us. And without this, there's no way to make progress, because as soon as you say, I'm doing cryptography and it's not FIPS, you're effectively excluded from making any further progress.
If there are hardware requirements, does that flow on to what you're doing on Amazon infrastructure?
So in that case, generally not, because you can't go to Amazon and say, please spin up Dell R720 servers for me, or I won't use you.
Right.
The FIPS is definitely more geared towards a traditional, you acquire hardware, install it in your own data center type model. I'm mostly illustrating that depending upon kind of how you're looking at it, FIPS can go into that level of detail. And in some cases, that would be the only way to actually get a FIPS validated implementation of a certain cryptographic library. In our case, we were able to find a way to use OpenSSL in a very specific way. And so there's no hardware requirement there, but there's a lot of software requirements. Yeah?
Does AWS being like FedRAMP authorized affect you guys in any way?
Yep, it does. And I'll get to that in just a few slides. It's a good question. So who's in this marketplace today? This is all public. You can go to fedramp.gov and you can view the marketplace and see who's who and who's doing what. I plucked a few names, so Google, Box, Microsoft, and Amazon, and I'll get to that in a minute. 104 of these organizations and their services have been authorized, 77 are in process, and 16 are in the ready state. If you look at these numbers, I think that 104 has been in progress for, it's taken many years for that to accumulate. So the fact that there are as many in progress and in ready state today means there's an uptick here in terms of how many organizations are entering this process and attempting to get authorized. Here's an example authorization. So this is one of Amazon's. They have separate authorizations for US East and West, and then for GovCloud, if you're familiar with GovCloud. This is sort of a special one-off region of Amazon's that is for very specific workloads for government agencies or anyone with really specific compliance requirements. You mentioned ITAR. That's one of the reasons why a company might use GovCloud is that they are bound by ITAR. And there's some US citizenship or US persons requirements placed upon who can actually touch GovCloud infrastructure. So I believe Amazon can only hire US citizens or persons to actually go in and interact with infrastructure inside of that GovCloud region. I've had it described to me in a way that makes me feel like there's literally a fence or a wall between two data centers, and one side is GovCloud and one side is US West. That's probably true based upon where I heard it from. But they have a separate authorization for US East and West. You can see that they provide IaaS and PaaS services. There's this impact level here, which might be interesting to you. FedRAMP has a low, a moderate, and a high impact level. And this is basically this basically controls how hard it is to get through the process, how many controls you have to meet. Low isn't suitable or workable for an organization like ours. It provides an actual security service. Because we are materially affecting the security posture of a customer that would use us by the very nature of what we do, we have to target moderate or higher. Some organizations or some CSPs, cloud service providers, might be able to get away with low. Maybe if you're just a CRM solution or you're providing a way to store documents or something like that. So Amazon US East and West is authorized at a moderate level. You can email them here if you have questions about that, and you can see the dates that they went in progress and then when they became authorized. So this was pretty quick for them. I think by this point they've gotten quite good at this. This was either the second or third authorization for US East and West. I touched a little bit on this. You can either partner with an agency and convince that agency to ride along and sponsor you, or you can go to the JAB, which is generally a heavier lift. In this case, I believe Amazon first got an agency authorization for East and West years back, and then came back and said, we actually want JAB because that's sort of a higher status way to get authorized. So there's a lot of minutia here and some politics like you might expect. You can be authorized with JAB, and that looks slightly better versus being authorized with only one agency who helped you, and that's not quite as meaningful. Any questions about any of that? No? Good. So I mentioned NIST plays heavily into FedRAMP. There's this giant security set of security controls in the form of NIST, 325 of them altogether, and I've sort of highlighted in red experientially where we've seen the largest lift or where we've had to give the most thought. A lot of these are things that are probably familiar to you. They use terms like contingency planning to effectively be disaster recovery. Most of these otherwise largely make sense to me at this moment, but I've also been in this world for a long time. So if you have questions about these, I could dig into sort of what at a high level these refer to. In some cases, we don't care as much about these. Physical and environmental protection, we basically inherit from Amazon. So that's a benefit of using an authorized provider, is we can just say, Amazon takes care of that, and the governmental agencies have already attested to the fact that Amazon is doing it right. So we don't have to worry about physical protection of Amazon data centers, nor really could we, even if we wanted to. Here's an example of the control, one of the 325. And I'm not going to read this for you, because I would hate my life. But if you just start reading some of these words, it doesn't make a lot of sense on the surface. And even after reading these a lot of times, they cannot make a lot of sense. And there's a lot of things in here that are really hand-wavy, like organization-defined personnel or roles, or organization-defined frequency. What does that even mean? It largely means we get to decide. But if you read these things, you're not left with a really strong prescriptive sense of what you need to do in order to satisfy this control. And this is not unique. Most of them are written this way. And so it takes a lot of time to read through these and distill out of it sort of what you actually need to do. There are companies that exist just to sort of turn this into something that you can actually comprehend. And we definitely spent some time with some of those companies. They've been very helpful. And again, this is just a sample. Then we get to that SSP. So this is, again, the giant document that you need to produce in order to even start the process. And so for us right now, this is a 423-page document. It started out with something like, I think, 50 pages of boilerplate in the form of the template. So a lot of that was content that we had to produce. This is not just content you can expect to forklift from other documents that you might have produced in the past. Some of the times that's true, or you can sort of look to take content you might have written around, again, disaster recovery and incorporate that in there in certain cases where it makes sense. This is just the document itself. There are tens of attachments that need to be included as well that include things like data flow diagrams, network architecture diagrams, a complete inventory of every piece of software you have, every operating system, every infrastructure component that exists, and then I already mentioned data flow diagrams. So there's a ton of content you need to produce. It seems never ending. And because we're a Google shop, I thought this was interesting. All these documents tend to temporarily, or in some cases permanently, break Google Docs. Mm-hmm. We see waiting for docs.google.com all the time. Almost all these docs are produced in Microsoft Word format from the federal agencies, and then we convert them so we can sort of hack on them together. It's not a fun time. I'm pretty sure when we go to actually submit any of these, we have to have them back in Word format, which is also not going to be a fun adventure. And it's not just that they need to be in Word format, they need to maintain all the formatting, which absolutely won't happen at this point. So we need to probably go and port all these docs manually back into the original format. We've even heard reports, I'm not a Windows person for the most part, but we've heard reports that even the Microsoft Office software for Macs doesn't do these documents justice, and we'll end up having to install Word on a Windows machine someplace in order to do this. So we'll see what that looks like. So you get all the way through this process, which is multiple years and many person months, if not years, of time and angst and anguish. I'm making it sound really terrible. It doesn't have to be. You're done. You're authorized. You can now sell into the marketplace. And this really just means continuous monitoring starts. So you have various refresh cycles that need to occur for almost everything you've just done. And this can be a week, it could be a month, it could be a quarter, it could be a year. Some of these things are 5 or 10 years. This is for most organizations, from what we've come to understand, multiple dedicated individuals from disparate parts of the organization that just focus on making sure we are always collecting the kind of information that the job needs, and we're providing it when necessary according to the schedules. Any questions about that in terms of FedRAMP overall? Yeah.
You said that that takes, like, it could take a year to just get all these documents together. Is there a big risk of this stuff being stale at like the end of the year, where you're like, oh, now I gotta go change 60% of this because my stuff's been updated? And
yeah, absolutely. There's a risk of both sort of divergence from what you're actually doing internally, and then I think there's the risk of diverging from what the guidance says you should do. And that guidance coming from the federal agencies. And so we've already seen along our journey multiple cases where the guidance has dramatically changed. Luckily, we've been tracking that very closely, and we're keeping an eye on it and making adjustments as they come in. But this could absolutely be a case where the rug sort of gets pulled out from underneath you. You think you're really close, and then all of a sudden, the world around you changes, and you can't control that. It doesn't matter, how good you're. Have a little bit more, I think. I got a bit of a late start. So a bunch of Amazon services are authorized. Some are in various stages of in progress, and then some are not in this list at all, which means there's no authorization in place for them. We have a really good relationship with Amazon, so we have some account managers that can sometimes seek information and return it for us. So we might occasionally get a heads up that, hey, in 12 plus months, this other service we're interested in could be authorized. But past that, this list is what everyone has to use as far as a point of reference and understanding which services are likely to be authorized in the near future, which ones already are, and some decisions have to be made about this when it comes to building out your infrastructure inside of your federal offering. Some examples of services that we're using today that are authorized are EC2 and EBS. Some other services we use that are authorized are RDS. Further down this list, I didn't include it in the slide. There's a large number of these, and I think this, again, is accelerating even from Amazon's perspective. Yeah?
Are there any services that just won't be supported?
I'm assuming the answer is yes. There are definitely services that are not authorized, and I have a slide showing you some of those today that are impacting us in a meaningful way. I've heard anecdotally that, sort of makes sense, Amazon will prioritize which services they're putting through this process based upon the perceived customer demand, and I think also their idea about lift internally, right? So there's this notion in some circles here that the services that Amazon has not chosen to authorize are probably the ones where they might have some weaker security properties in place. And so that's even more of a reason why that joint authorization board might look at those services with a questionable vantage point. Here's some services that are not authorized today, ones that we happen to use. So SES, which is a simple email service. It's effectively a platform as a service offering to send and receive email without having to run all of your own mail server infrastructure. And then Cloud HSM, which is, if you're familiar with what an HSM is, it's an Amazon version of this construct. We use this in a few places to store private key information or other sensitive data and perform certain cryptographic functions on our behalf. So this is not authorized. And when it comes to our ability to use these services, it really comes down to us either saying it's not worth it, let's not even try, or we have to end up trying to justify our use of this based upon kind of the intersection of the kind of data that we process in these services. Again, going back to that federal data and those three letters CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Also the importance that service has in our platform and sort of what happens if that service is unavailable or insecure. And so for SES, options that we have, if we can't use that to send email but still need to send email, are not great. They are effectively saying, let's pump email data outside of Amazon, which is not really a huge security benefit from my or many other individuals' perspective, or trying to run our own sort of MTA or mail services, which is easier said than done at the scale at which we operate today. So we'd like to avoid that too if possible. For Cloud HSM, any approach that doesn't use this for us today means we're taking a step backwards from a security perspective. So we'd like to avoid having to take this very sensitive key data and store it on disk or elsewhere outside of these hardened devices that are meant sort of fit for purpose there.
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Is SES like on the timeline? Does it have
Not
a
as far as
status
no,
or
not
what?
as far as no,
Okay, so
not there
it's-
today. And the same is true for Cloud HSM.
Is KMS something you could use that would be?
KMS is somewhere on the spectrum. I don't remember exactly where. So there's some possibility we could leverage that.
I know it's not the same thing.
Yeah. That's a good call out though. So here's some other things that we've sort of learned and where we've made some changes specifically for FedRAMP. We had solutions to these problems in place before, but we've sort of adjusted our thinking, and we think these solutions will work better for us. This is a canned image, but it still effectively shows a model of what we're doing here. Does anybody else use federated access to their Amazon console today? Yeah. Do you know what sort of tooling is behind that, or?
I believe we use one login for it.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense. An interesting challenge that we face is that our own service would really help solve a lot of these problems. And it's easy for us to say we should use that because we're close to it, we understand it. There's also the aspect that it really is a great solution. And when we look at how to satisfy these controls, our own solution would check many of the boxes in what we think are the best ways, which is good validation that we're doing the right things, but it's not helpful here. We can't authorize our product by using our own product that's not authorized. We also have chicken and egg concerns around availability, like you might expect. We can't control access to our infrastructure with our own product, because if our infrastructure was broken, we then couldn't access it to fix it. So we instead have to sort of look outside of our own ecosystem and figure out how we're going to get these same properties. In this case, we're a Google shop. We're familiar with Google. We like certain aspects of their tech stack there, so we're going to use them as our identity provider, and then federate access from Amazon to them. Another sort of new service or capability that we brought on, at least a difference in terms of how we're managing this kind of data, is using parameter store. Does anyone else do anything with this? I see a nod. I assume I know sort of what you're doing, but what kind of use cases do you have for parameter store?
Yeah, storing secrets. Before AWS announced Secrets Manager.
Okay.
It was something we used for secrets.
Secrets Manager is much newer, correct?
It came out like in April.
Yeah.
So it's brand new.
And this is in progress in JAB review, which is pretty close to the end. Secrets Manager is not anywhere on the spectrum as far as I know. I think we were investigating both options, if I'm not mistaken. So this is generically speaking, or from a high level perspective, a way for us to store sensitive data or secrets in a way that satisfies a lot of the FedRAMP compliance requirements, but is also compatible with a lot of our existing automation tooling. We use Ansible really heavily, both to deploy infrastructure and also to make changes to it, as sort of an orchestration tool, also config management. Is anyone else using Ansible, or are you familiar with Ansible? Yeah. Okay.
We use it, yeah.
Okay, cool. So Ansible has some existing ability to plug into this, and then we're sort of enhancing what's there, or coming up with an approach that's a little bit more suited to our specific use cases. Primarily for generating, storing, and retrieving secrets in a way that doesn't require them to sit on disk. We also use some services that are not AWS. So what does that mean? How does that impact FedRAMP? We use a service called Signal Sciences, which is fantastic. If you're looking for a web application firewall or some similar solution, and your security stance allows you to use a cloud-based provider for such things, I'd look into it. For us, this has been really great, striking an awesome balance between providing real security value without requiring any kind of real operational lift or ongoing maintenance past a tiny bit of integration work we had to do at the beginning. I'm used to WAFs and those kinds of products really not doing much other than blocking script kiddies, and also being a big pain in the rear in terms of ongoing maintenance and keeping them up to date. There's John, one of our founders, saying good things about it, so it's got to be good. We also use a tool called VictorOps. This is sort of like PagerDuty. They just got sucked up by Splunk, or I should say acquired, slurped up, splunked up, I don't know, whatever. There's probably a joke in there somewhere. That service works well for us, but not in Amazon, and none of these are FedRAMP authorized, by the way. Pingdom, if you're familiar, black box monitoring, pretty basic stuff. It's not the only signal that helps us understand if our services are working, but it's one of them, one of the many signals. And again, not an authorized service, also not in Amazon. And so we have to sort of make the same distinction, or we have to make the same case if we want to use these things in the federal product by going to the JAB, by working with our third-party advisor to help them understand specifically how we're using these services, what sort of data flows to and from them, and what the overall sort of risk to our ability to be good stewards for federal data is, with that in mind.
Having thought about it for like 10 seconds.
Yeah.
It feels like Pingdom probably is something you can make a case for, like, all right, it's just, there's no federal data going out to it.
Yep.
Is that like the right idea, that these are services
Yes.
that you can make a compelling case and they go, yep, check,
Yep.
that's out of the box?
Because it is literally just hitting endpoints that are already publicly available. There's nothing special about what it's doing. You could go to your home computer and hit the same URL that this does. So for that very reason, and you nailed it, this is a much easier lift than these other two. VictorOps is probably somewhere in the middle, because we could send, if we goofed or we weren't really being diligent, we could send data to them that would help identify a federal customer, or maybe come directly from a federal customer. This is sort of like avoiding the classic problem where you're leaking too much information into your logs. We have a really good track record there, and I think we might be successful on that end. Signal Sciences, it gets a little muddier, because this is effectively us streaming things like IP addresses and requests to a cloud provider. And even if they don't directly allow that service, meaning operations folks at Signal Sciences to understand what customer of ours this came from, or what users on that end are requesting these URLs, I think we're starting to we're starting to get to a place where we have a larger lift in advocating for our use of that service. And so we're still in discovery mode for some of this stuff, but hopefully this helps kind of illustrate the sort of spectrum of concerns that might exist and how you have to approach each one a little bit differently. Any questions about that? a good observation. Something else we've shifted away from, or shifted to, I should say, is a VPN for accessing certain parts of the infrastructure. One of the aspects of our product is actually an addition of Duo called Beyond. We've taken a lot of the ideas that came out of Google in this idea they have called Beyond Corp. Some folks attach the term zero trust to some of these same properties. That's a whole talk in and of itself, but effectively, a lot of this is a movement away from solutions like VPNs, where it matters what position you're on in the network in order to sort of gate your access to services or data. Unfortunately, FedRAMP has a hard requirement wherein you have to, from a network level perspective, be connected. I should say, whenever you're connected to the federal environment from a management perspective, you cannot connect anywhere else. And there's really no way to achieve this from the standpoint of remote access without a VPN or a VPN-like solution. The only option that would exist that I can imagine, I'm sure there are more, but the easiest one for me to imagine would be you walk up to your desk that's in some sort of very heavily controlled environment that is hardwired into a direct connection to Amazon and can get nowhere else on the internet. And you can only ever operate against infrastructure when you're using that specific workstation. A solution like that might allow you to get away without needing a VPN, but if you want to use a laptop or access remotely in any capacity, this was the easiest way for us to go. We evaluated a lot of options. We could have used OpenVPN with some custom code that we would have written. We ended up using a commercial solution, and that's working pretty well for us so far. This is kind of a fun one, or an interesting one, I think. NIST has a lot of requirements around anti-malware, antivirus. A lot of the federal agencies are using Windows very heavily, even on servers. Not super surprising. That's a big part of their ecosystem from an IT perspective. That is not us. We don't run our service on Windows. We're Linux, as you might expect, as is commonly the case in Amazon for the kinds of services that we provide. If we were to just follow the guidance and do the checkboxy dance, we would probably end up doing something like installing ClamAV on every host, which from our perspective provides zero security benefit, and in fact probably causes harm in terms of we've sort of increased the threat surface or attack surface, and we've probably hampered performance at the same time. So we don't want to do that. So we've had a lot of good conversations with folks at the JAB, at the PMO, about sort of what we can do on this end. And we feel really good about an approach that sort of combines a bunch of different tools. I alluded to this a little bit here. The sort of Linux or Unix philosophy of using purpose-built small tooling. So we're going to end up combining a lot of these to get the same end result, or I should say, be able to satisfy these controls, but in a slightly different way. The good news from our perspective is that we were able to have these conversations and got really good feedback about how these parties, even though NIST may say somewhat contrary things today, see that this is sort of where the industry is going. And they made it clear that this kind of conversation, along with some other feedback we've given them, will actually be incorporated into future guidance. So it feels really like this is a two-way street, which I think is really powerful. And it goes to say that compliance doesn't always mean better security, right? Checking the boxes doesn't always mean you're actually doing something that's materially better than what you were doing beforehand. So we're really careful to make sure that we don't kind of regress from a security perspective just to meet these compliance requirements. Yes, question?
So I recently was trying to integrate ClamAV for a client, and it like destroyed the performance to the point that it was like a launch blocker.
Yep.
What you said though, the other part was this, like it actually increases the threat.
Yeah, so
surface. Or whatever.
So primarily from the standpoint that you now have sort of like a persistent binary that has probably root level access to the whole system. And its intent is very much to sort of actively monitor processes and running code elsewhere. So the problematic aspect of that is now you have this sort of like root level construct that doesn't get the same level of sort of rigor or testing that we feel a lot of the other components at the operating system level do. We have less of an ability to attest to its security properties. And historically speaking, these kind of antivirus solutions have had a lot of security issues. So we just don't like the idea of this software existing on our hosts if we can avoid it somehow.
Okay, thanks.
Maybe just a quick story. Microsoft's antivirus was looking for malicious JavaScript by executing it, and it wasn't properly sandboxed.
Oh.
And so if malicious JavaScript was sent to your computer over a network connection, your computer would execute it. That's an example of how an antivirus can actually decrease your security.
Interesting.
You also run the risk of, we saw it with the NotPetya, with the MS, I can't remember the exact key for it, but many of the antivirus companies out there pushed out an update and said, hey, you need to apply this update to the root of the system, and it blue screened a ton of computers. Symantec actually had to roll back and say, don't update. A bunch of the manufacturers said, even Microsoft came back and they pulled their update back because the signature update basically destroyed your system. So these non-enterprise, ClamAV and some of these other ones, they're actually using data further up the chain from the bigger antivirus companies to get to where they're going. And the testing on Windows systems specifically or across the boards on all the different variants is really thin.
Interesting.
Push the button, hope it works then.
Jeez.
Yeah, so we're still sort of working on our full story here, but I feel good about it. And this sort of alludes to where I wanted to end off. Compliance is often not black and white. A lot of times you're in this sort of gray territory. You can let that get you down and sort of live in a state of despair. I like to think that we've found really good opportunities to turn that into a positive. In cases that relate directly to the last slide, so I think we've already had an influence on these federal agencies in a positive way. I also think there's an opportunity to sort of educate these individuals and help ensure that we can implement better solutions, and this will have a sort of overall positive effect on other agencies, other cloud service providers, everyone involved in this kind of compliance program. I think there's opportunities there even outside of FedRAMP. We treat even things like SOC 2 audits or those sets of compliance requirements very similarly, where we sort of feel like we're up against a hard block or barrier and we don't like what we feel we would have to do in order to overcome. We'll often have conversations and sort of look for creative ways to find a blend of approaches that works for us, and I think we've been very successful there. So I'd recommend sort of thinking about that when you're faced with compliance thinking or decisions in your future. Also, I'm really excited about not just for Duo, but for everyone in this ecosystem, leveling up what the federal government and agencies are able to use and the security properties they can implement as a result. There's a huge number of users that are impacted by this. It has an impact on how all of us sort of live, breathe, and die as a result. We're all influenced by the government to some extent. So I think it's an exciting time to be sort of part of this journey into the cloud that many of the federal agencies are taking. And it's a really powerful means to democratize security. And that is all for me. Any questions? I know I've asked lots of times, so many questions have already been slung at me. Anything else I can touch on at the tail end here?
It seems like you guys have a separate federal product as opposed to a regular consumer product. How often do you see features or things you've learned from one move in between the two?
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer to that question is fairly consistently, and you're right in that we effectively have separate products. This is for a few reasons. One, like anyone else, we are making decisions based upon what we think the customer interest will be, based upon what features we implement, and then deciding kind of what the ROI is on the effort that goes into bringing them into FedRAMP. In some cases, some things we do are just not going to fly. We have a lot of organizations that use our service and want to use telephony as a factor. So you saw me use push, or I can use my hard token. We also support calling a phone and reading a code or sending a text message to your device. For some of our customers, that's their preferred way to add second factor. In the federal ecosystem, that doesn't have as large, there's not as large of an appetite for that kind of solution for lots of reasons. That mostly makes sense. So we haven't bothered to bring that to our federal product, at least not in the initial state, for instance. And in many cases, a lot of the work that we've been doing to meet the compliance requirements here, we're sort of actively looking for excuses to make sure that that effort can pay off in other areas. It's not always possible. I can call it exceptions, like we're not going to implement VPNs everywhere. But in many of the other cases, we can take the learnings and take the capabilities we built out for FedRAMP and bring them back, roll them back into the commercial product.
Yeah, it's almost like neither one is an upstream of the other one, so to speak.
Yeah, there's sort of like a subset of each that overlaps.